What do you think you know about autistic people?
Throughout the 20th century in America, misinformation regarding autism led to the tragic, widespread maltreatment and oppression of autistic people by autistic people in positions of authority. The modern-day organized autistic community is currently working to triumph over these societal hurdles by enhancing inclusivity and support for autistic people with different abilities.
The year is 1960. For the first time ever, autism is used as a diagnosis separate from other conditions. This new term, however, was accompanied by disturbing new ideas for so-called treatments from so-called experts. Parents and caregivers of autistic people, heartened by this new term for this newly labeled neurotype, rushed to implement these damaging methods, testing these untested practices on the members of society that, at the time, were barely considered human. There was not a single law in the U.S. in the 60s ensuring that developmentally disabled people were educated. This lack of education led to autistic people knowing very little about their own neurotype, and left them even more vulnerable to abuse and mistreatment, and largely unable to criticize these practices. Methods such as electroshock were abhorrently common in the 60s among nearly all exploited disabled minorities. But while many other disabled communities managed to at least somewhat escape these cruelties by educating their oppressors in the 70s and 80s, the sheer lack of accurate information about autism available at the time led to a continuation of disproportionate mistreatment and abuse. Very little changed when it came to the quality of life for autistic people in the 1970s and 80s, as the development of accurate autism research remained at a standstill. Neurotypical researchers still showed an outright refusal to consider autistic perspectives on autism. Neurotypical Society's view of autism in the U.S. only worsened in the 1990s when the introduction of a broader definition of autism set off a chain reaction of public misinformation. This new, more encompassing, and more accurate definition led to a higher number of autism diagnoses, but rather than celebrating this correction of a long-time scientific error, the neurotypical public attributed this rise in diagnoses to a so-called autism epidemic. Out of this panic arose equally misinformed groups, calling themselves charities, with an attitude that autism was a condition that autistic people, and, more importantly to these groups, neurotypical people, would be better off without. Among these groups was the soon-to-be notorious Autism Speaks, founded in 2006. To put it simply, the misinformed neurotypical masses sent an influx of research money to the misinformed supergroup, who then sent this money to misinformed researchers, basing their research on the very same misinformation. Most autism specialists were paid to focus on proving the beliefs of their sponsors, rather than ever researching issues impacting autistic people, causing a shortage of both funds and public interest in the actual well-being of the autistic community. This chain reaction continues today and still goes largely uncriticized. The organization of a solid autistic, self-advocating community is a fairly recent development. Though Autism Speaks unfortunately remains by far the most prominent autism-related organization in the U.S., an autistic-led grassroots advocacy group called the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, is gaining recognition by organizing the community, advocating for more accessible spaces, and giving much-needed support to autistic culture. Self-advocacy organizations far more accurately represent and work toward the goals that will actually impact the quality of autistic life. For instance, while Autism Speaks advocates for what they call person-first language, or people referring to autistic people as people with autism, which is supposedly to promote a more humanizing attitude, ASAN, led by autistic people themselves, actually works to make spaces such as businesses, schools, and entertainment spaces more accessible places for autistic people to be. In fact,
This person-first language advocated for by Autism Speaks actually indicates that this organization still operates under similar misconceptions to the falsehoods it was founded under. The majority of the autistic community actually supports identity-first language, while referring to autistic people as just that, autistic people, so as not to portray autism as a negative or shameful aspect, but as an integral and natural part of themselves, more comparative to being left-handed than to a disease. While it should never be the responsibility of autistic people to educate allistic people about autism, the true epidemic, that of misinformation, can surely be combated by making basic facts about autism known to neurotypicals. Most importantly, neurotypicals can intrinsically never have more knowledge about the autistic experience than autistic people, but is also what makes communication between autistic people and neurotypical people so necessary when attending to the needs of the autistic community. Autism is classified as a developmental disability. A video made by the previously mentioned ASAN for newly diagnosed autistic people explains this simply as, autistic people are disabled by a world that isn't set up to support autistic people, meaning that the term disability, when applied to autism, refers to difficulties faced in implementing one's ability and contributing in a society unfit to accommodate the autistic neurotype, rather than an inherent lack of ability. Sensory differences and sensory processing disorders are common in autistic people, and are very often misunderstood by neurotypical parents and caregivers. Many autistic people experience resources to aid sensory difficulties, such as available ear defender headphones for sensory overload, despite this being a fairly simple issue to fix. Autistic people have a much harder time communicating when experiencing sensory overload. And while neurotypical parents and caregivers often express a desire to communicate more with their autistic loved ones, they often refuse to listen to the different needs of these people and apply neurotypical standards to people with integrally autistic minds, effectively handicapping their loved one further than their autism ever would, if correctly accommodated. Self-stimulatory behavior, or stimming, is a natural and necessary part of autistic life. Stimming can be viewed by an autistic person as being the autistic person's version of body language. Particular stims vary from person to person, but the purposes remain similar: self-regulation, sensory seeking, and self-expression. A very common stim is flapping one's hands. From a neurotypical perspective, where one might smile when excited, an autistic person might flap their hands instead. If the autistic person has basic knowledge of autism and stimming, communication between these two can be easy. However, as usual, accurate knowledge about this aspect of autistic life is available but rarely sought out by neurotypicals. An often incredibly harmful and common aspect of misinformed autism treatments is the suppression of stimming. Many neurotypicals, uneducated on the benefits of stimming, find stimming in public to be off-putting, socially unacceptable. Holistic society has made it so unacceptable for autistic people to practice this necessary behavior of self-regulation publicly. Parents and caregivers commonly shame their autistic loved ones for a behavior that, to them, feels as natural as smiling. Autism is a natural and incredible aspect of humanity, despite every long-standing, misinformed attitude autistic people face. Wherever humanity grows and develops, there too will be autistic people, sharing in the special, beautiful, neurological experience that is autism. They are of every race, age, and gender, and, just as neurotypicals do, have a range of unique abilities and struggles. The autistic community today is slowly but surely making strides for a better quality of autistic life in America, gracefully self-advocating to tear down ableism and ignorance, to rebuild America's long misguided view of this neurotype. They have overcome an incredible amount especially for a group so dependent on each other for support. Full autistic civil rights has not yet been achieved, and ableism still weaves its way through the fabric of America and the minds of so many neurotypicals, presenting itself in the forms of groups like Autism Speaks, of caregivers suppressing autistic traits in their loved ones, in the high undiagnosis rates in autistic women and racial minorities, in misguided and often hateful goals to eradicate autism from the world, and in the overall refusal to listen to and stand by this community in their struggle for equity. It has been said in many a press conference with a noticeable lack of actual autistic people that autism speaks. May all Americans, even those who don't encounter autistic people in their daily life, have the clarity to recognize the cruel irony in statements such as this.